It was a particularly damp and fog-laden evening in London when I received an urgent message that would soon embroil Sherlock Holmes and myself in yet another perplexing mystery. The note, penned in a delicate hand and delivered by an agitated footman, read simply, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a matter of utmost discretion and urgency. Your presence is required immediately at Cavendish House. The household fears scandal. Lady Eleanor Fairchild." Holmes, who at the moment was idly studying the erratic smoke patterns of his sitting-room pipe, did not even glance at me as I handed him the message. Instead, he allowed his sharp eyes to scan the envelope with an intensity that made the paper seem almost transparent. "Watson," he murmured, a trace of impatience in his voice, "it appears we are to attend to a lady in distress who fears the exposure of some indiscretion. A minor jewel theft, perhaps, or an affair of manners. But the true challenge, my dear Watson, and you have already deduced this from a mere note." Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed no levity. "From the type of paper, the pressure of the writing, the urgency implied by a messenger rather than a letter, and the peculiar way the signature is penned, it is all quite transparent to one trained in the observation of human character. But we shall see soon enough, shall we?" By the time we arrived at Cavendish House, a grand townhouse on the quieter end of Piccadilly, night had fully settled over London. The gas lamps struggled against the creeping fog, casting long, trembling shadows along the cobbled streets. A footman, pale and twitching, led us through corridors adorned with heavy draperies and the scent of polished oak, finally ushering us into a drawing-room that appeared almost untouched by worry, save for Lady Eleanor herself. She was a woman of distinguished presence, though her fine features were marred by unmistakable anxiety. Her eyes, large and dark, darted from one corner of the room to another, as if she expected the missing item to materialize out of thin air. "Mr. Holmes," she began in a tremulous voice, "I am at my wits' end. This morning, when I entered my private cabinet, the Fairchild sapphire, an heirloom of generations, was gone. I cannot imagine how this could have happened, for only myself and my most trusted attendants had access. And yet it has vanished." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Pray describe the circumstances exactly, Lady Fairchild. Every detail, however trivial it may seem, is important." Lady Eleanor took a trembling breath. "The cabinet was locked, as it always is, with the key on a chain that hangs around my neck. I discovered the lock intact, and yet the sapphire, a jewel of remarkable size and deep azure, is no longer there. No note was left, no sign of forced entry. Only the faint scent of rosewater lingers on the velvet lining." Holmes' eyes narrowed, and his fingers drummed lightly on the arm of the chair. "A faint scent, you say? And the servants? Have they been questioned?" "Yes," she replied quickly. "They are loyal beyond measure. They are as bewildered as I am and utterly distraught." Holmes rose and began a meticulous survey of the room, his eyes catching the subtle imperfections in the drapery, the faint dust upon the mahogany, and the slight smudge on the glass cabinet door. "Curious," he murmured almost to himself. "Very curious indeed. Watson, observe the details. There is nothing here that is immediately alarming, yet something is amiss. As often as not, the simplest observation, overlooked by the frantic, holds the key to unraveling the most perplexing of puzzles." I could not help but feel the familiar stir of anticipation. Here once again I would be witness to the great Sherlock Holmes in the act of piecing together a mystery that would leave Scotland Yard confounded. Little did we know this case, the vanishing of a jewel so rare and prized, would test Holmes's legendary faculties to their limits. Holmes did not waste a moment. With a measured, almost reverent touch, he approached the cabinet, his eyes scanning every corner with the precision of a hawk observing its prey. He ran a gloved hand along the edges of the mahogany door, noting the faint indentation near the keyhole, as though the lock had been manipulated with an unusual care. Watson, standing beside him with a notebook poised, observed with equal parts awe and frustration, unable to divine what his friend perceived so clearly. "Notice, Watson," Holmes murmured without looking up. "The dust on the lower edge of the cabinet door is undisturbed, yet there is a smudge near the keyhole. That suggests the door was indeed locked when last accessed, but not in the manner one might expect. A careful hand, someone who knows exactly how to manipulate such a mechanism, could remove the contents without leaving obvious signs. I scribbled furiously, attempting to record his words while my mind raced. You mean someone could take the jewel without breaking in? I asked, incredulous. Precisely, Holmes replied, finally turning to face me, his eyes glinting with the thrill of deduction, a trivial detail perhaps to most. But to those trained in the observation of human error, it is paramount. And observe this. The faint scent of rosewater is strongest on the velvet lining, yet dissipates abruptly toward the edges. A careless hand would have left it more evenly distributed. This, Watson, tells me that the thief was deliberate, almost ritualistic in the handling of the jewel. Lady Eleanor had remained silent, her hands tightly clasped, as Holmes worked in his characteristic methodical fashion. She leaned forward suddenly, her voice a mixture of hope and desperation. Can you truly find it, Mr. Holmes? It is our family's most treasured possession. Without it, I fear ruin, both social and financial. Holmes inclined his head slightly, not in reassurance but in acknowledgement of her anxiety. Fear not, Lady Fairchild. In time all puzzles yield to patient inquiry and attention to detail. Watson, I shall need to question the household. The footman who had brought us in appeared again, and Holmes's eyes fixed on him sharply. Name? He asked. Jenkins, sir, the man replied, bowing slightly. And you have been in the household for nearly 10 years, sir. I know the comings and goings of everyone here, sir. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Excellent. And you were present this morning when Lady Fairchild discovered the loss? Yes, sir. I was sent to fetch her maid, but the lady found it herself before anyone could intervene. Holmes took careful notes, then turned his attention to the other attendants, questioning each briefly but with pointed scrutiny. His queries were simple, almost innocuous, yet framed in such a manner that any inconsistency would become evident. As the servant spoke, Watson and I watched, marveling at the subtle changes in his demeanor, a tilt of the head, a faint narrowing of the eyes, a slight pursing of the lips, all silent signals to himself, clues upon which he would later elaborate. Once the household had been questioned, Holmes moved to examine the cabinet itself more closely. He opened the lock with a key Lady Eleanor had provided, then ran his fingers along the velvet lining. See here, Watson, he said, holding up a small piece of dislodged thread. A fragment of silk, barely perceptible, yet vital. Whoever removed the jewel must have brushed against the lining with their sleeve. And the silk is of a distinct weave, unusual in any household garment. We shall see whose clothing this matches. I bent closer, intrigued. And this will lead us to the thief. Possibly, Holmes replied, placing the fragment carefully into a small envelope. At the very least, it will eliminate certain possibilities. Every anomaly, however slight, narrows the field of suspects. He then examined the cabinet's glass front. Using a magnifying lens, he traced faint streaks along the surface. The glass shows marks consistent with a hand that is left dominant. A right-handed individual would have produced a different pattern. Such details may seem trifling, Watson, but in matters of human observation, the devil resides precisely in the minutiae. Watson, eager as ever to assist, attempted to recall the movements of the servants and Lady Eleanor herself, but found his memory less exact than Holmes's razor-sharp focus. The detective, noting my distraction, gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible, as though humoring my enthusiasm. Let us now consider motive, he said. The thief, clearly adept, removed the jewel without leaving overt signs. Who benefits from its absence? And for what purpose? And for what purpose? Lady Eleanor's brow furrowed. It is a family heirloom. Surely someone desires only to sell it, or perhaps to cause me embarrassment. Holmes made a slight, almost imperceptible motion of his hand. Both are possibilities. But observe, there are no pawnbroker marks, no evidence of hasty handling, and the jewel is too valuable to be disposed of secretly without risk. This suggests to me that the perpetrator is not acting out of immediate greed. There is another element, a personal incentive, Watson. Something intimate, perhaps, that involves trust, knowledge, and opportunity. I frowned, sensing the layers beneath his deductions. You mean, the thief is someone within the household? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he moved toward the window, peering out at the fog-shrouded street. Let us not be hasty in judgment. Opportunity and motive must coincide, yet not all is apparent at first glance. We must continue our investigation, carefully observing who enters and exits this scene of crime. noting their habits, and scrutinizing the environment for the subtle signals most would overlook. He paused, then turned to Lady Eleanor. "Pray show me again the chain by which the key hangs. Its position, the tension of the link, the slightest wear or bend, all may indicate the precise method by which the cabinet was accessed." As she handed it to him, Holmes's fingers traced the chain with meticulous care. He examined the clasp, the slight indentation on the metal where it had rubbed against something hard, the uneven polish. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, take note. The chain has been subtly altered. Perhaps a minor repair, perhaps deliberate. Either way, it is a clue." Lady Eleanor watched, her expression a mix of hope and perplexity. "You truly believe the jewel can be recovered?" Holmes inclined his head. "I do not merely believe, Lady Fairchild. I know that with patience, observation, and the proper application of logic, the path to resolution becomes clear. But we must first understand the full extent of events surrounding this disappearance." He returned the chain to her, then turned to me with a flash of determination in his eyes. "Come, Watson. There is much to uncover, and the night is young. Our investigation must proceed with both precision and discretion, for one never knows what hidden movements occur while London sleeps beneath its shroud of fog." With that, we left the drawing room, stepping back into the shadowed corridors of Cavendish House, where the faint glimmer of candlelight danced on polished surfaces, masking secrets yet to be revealed. I could feel the tension building, the sense that every object, every gesture, and every subtle trace was a fragment of a larger puzzle that only Holmes could piece together. This section develops the investigation. Holmes's meticulous examination of the cabinet and keychain, introduction of subtle, logically significant clues, smudge, rosewater scent, silk thread, left-handedness, building of suspense through methodical observation. Watson's role as the narrator and contrast to Holmes's brilliance. We returned to Baker Street later that evening, the fog outside London's streets pressing against the window panes like a living shroud. Holmes wasted no time in spreading the evidence before him across the familiar table, the silk fragment, the chain with its subtle wear, and his meticulous notes on the cabinet. He examined each item with a care that bordered on obsession, as though the slightest distraction might cost him the clarity of insight. "Watson," he said, breaking the silence, "observe the sequence here. The cabinet shows no signs of forced entry, yet the jewel is gone. The silk fragment suggests an individual brushed against the lining, possibly with a sleeve of unusual weave. The keychain's alteration indicates prior handling or deliberate tampering, and the rosewater scent, a telltale of someone who is either methodical or attempting to create a false impression of innocence. All these details must converge to indicate the precise circumstances of the theft." I frowned. "But Holmes, how are we to narrow the field? There are several attendants and family members who have access. How do we determine who is capable of such precision?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and began pacing, the light from the gas lamps flickering across his intense features. "We consider not merely the act itself, Watson, but the subtleties of human character. The thief is clever, cautious, and intimately familiar with the household. One does not casually remove a family heirloom in such a manner without knowledge of both its location and the habits of those surrounding it." He paused, turning suddenly to me. "We must investigate opportunity in tandem with motive. The individual who had both is exceedingly limited, and yet even within that small group, there are misdirections and deliberate obfuscations to contend with." The following morning, we returned to Cavendish House. Holmes requested the presence of all household staff in the drawing room, a formal assembly that seemed to unsettle even Lady Eleanor. Each servant, maid, butler, footman, and housekeeper stood as if expecting admonishment, yet wary of revealing too much. Holmes surveyed them with piercing eyes, noting the posture, the slight tremor of a hand, the nervous twitch, and the subtle avoidance of direct gaze. "Let us begin with simple inquiries," he said, his voice even, almost soothing. "Each of you will recount precisely your movements during the morning hours when Lady Fairchild discovered the jewel's absence. Remember, even small deviations from truth are easily observed." The maid, a young woman named Clara, spoke first. She described her routine in the household, attending first to the morning chambers before assisting Lady Eleanor. Her account was detailed, yet Holmes's gaze lingered on her hands, observing a faint trace of dust along the knuckles, as if she had brushed against something she should not have touched. Next, Jenkins, the footman, recounted his own movements, emphasizing that he had been fetching Lady Eleanor's personal items when the discovery occurred. Holmes's attention, however, was drawn to the slight wear on the heel of his boot, incongruent with the expected polish and care he usually maintained. The subtle imperfection hinted at movement in a location he might prefer to conceal. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, spoke last, her voice firm and measured. She described the cabinet's routine cleaning and the handling of the key. Holmes listened intently, his eyes narrowing at a momentary hesitation when she mentioned polishing the velvet lining. A trivial pause, but one that registered in Holmes's analytical mind as significant. Once the staff had departed, Holmes turned to Lady Eleanor. "Madam, it is not my intention to cause offence or suspicion, but we must consider all possibilities, including those closest to you. There are elements in the room, minute and easily overlooked, that suggest deliberate planning. I ask only your patience as we examine them." He then proceeded to inspect the cabinet once more, noting the angle of the light, the reflection on the glass, and the slight irregularity of the floorboards beneath it. "Watson," he said, "note the scuff marks. They are subtle, yet they indicate a deliberate positioning of the cabinet, perhaps to create a shadow or to conceal an approach. Whoever did this is not merely familiar with the contents, but with the precise orientation of the room itself. An intimate acquaintance indeed." As we concluded our examination, Holmes's gaze fell upon a small pile of correspondence on Lady Eleanor's writing desk. He rifled through the letters, paying close attention not to the words themselves, but to the manner in which each had been handled. "Notice, Watson, the indentations in the paper. Certain letters bear the weight of a fingertip in a way that suggests prior handling by someone of a particular stature. Compare this to the silk fragment and you begin to see a pattern forming." I followed his hand movements, trying to see what he saw. "Do you think the thief came from within the household?" I asked more assertively this time. Holmes paused, his eyes distant yet focused. "I am inclined to believe so. External intrusions tend to be messy and impulsive. This is deliberate, controlled, almost rehearsed. And, as always, the smallest traces, the scent, the thread, the impression, are often the most revealing." We spent the remainder of the day retracing the morning's events, examining each hallway, the cabinet room, and the approaches to Lady Eleanor's quarters. Holmes's attention to detail was relentless. He noted the precise angle of the sunlight through the eastern window, the slight creak in a floorboard near the corridor, and the faint scuff on a chair leg. Each element, insignificant on its own, coalesced in his mind into a mental map of the thief's actions. By evening, as the gas lamps flickered against the London fog, Holmes reclined in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Watson," he said quietly, "the initial accounts suggest a simple theft, yet simplicity is rarely the hallmark of genius or duplicity. We have clues, but they are scattered and disguised. Our next step is to observe, not merely question. One move too early, and the perpetrator may recognize our awareness and retreat into the shadows. I sat back, pen in hand, recording every detail for posterity, yet increasingly aware that our investigation was moving beyond mere observation. Holmes' mind was active, turning over each fragment of evidence, weighing the significance of every subtle inconsistency. I could sense the thrill of the chase, the quiet hum of deduction that only he could hear, and I understood that in this intricate web of deception, one misstep could unravel the delicate threads he sought to follow. As the night deepened and London's fog thickened, I realized with mounting anticipation that the vanishing jewel case was far more complex than it appeared. The surface simplicity masked a labyrinth of subtle actions, carefully concealed motives, and human psychology, all waiting to be untangled by the singular intellect of Sherlock Holmes. And as always, I, faithful chronicler and companion, would witness every revelation, every misdirection, and every brilliant unraveling as it occurred. The following morning, the air in Cavendish House was heavy with anticipation, the hush of dawn amplifying the faint creaks and sighs of the grand old building. Holmes and I returned at a precise hour, as if the very clockwork of the household were under his scrutiny. Lady Eleanor met us in the drawing-room. Her anxiety softened only slightly, by the hope that her most treasured possession might soon be recovered. Holmes wasted no time in directing his attention to the servants, requesting their presence once again. "We must observe not only what is said, but how it is said," he reminded me quietly, his eyes already sweeping the room with the meticulous precision of a predatory bird. Deception, Watson, is rarely blatant. It whispers in gestures, hesitations, and the minutest contradictions. Each servant took their place, standing as if on trial, yet uncertain of what they were being tested for. Holmes began with Clara, the young maid whose hands had earlier betrayed the faint trace of dust on her knuckles. He inquired casually about her morning tasks, noting the rise and fall of her voice, the slight twitch when she mentioned the handling of delicate items, and the way her eyes shifted toward the cabinet when she spoke. "Tell me, Clara," Holmes said in that calm yet incisive tone that left no room for casual evasion, "did anyone assist you in moving items within Lady Fairchild's private cabinet?" Clara hesitated, the faintest stammer escaping her lips. I did not, sir. I only dusted the cabinet and tidied the surrounding shelves." Holmes's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. "Indeed, and yet, Watson, observe her hesitation. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it exists. Now, we shall not make accusations on suspicion alone, but it is often in such hesitations that truth and falsehood collide." He then turned to Jenkins, the footman, who had previously drawn our attention with the irregular wear on his boots. "Jenkins," Holmes said, "the cabinet is locked and yet the jewel is missing. You were present at the time of discovery. Were there any unusual occurrences, perhaps unnoticed by Lady Eleanor that morning?" The man's gaze flickered, his posture stiffening. "Nothing, sir," he replied quickly. Everything appeared as usual. Holmes made a slight gesture, dismissive but calculated. "Very well. Watson, the inconsistency lies not in overt statements, but in their interplay with observable actions. Consider the scuff on Jenkins' boots, the silk fragment and the position of the chain. We are beginning to trace the choreography of the theft, though it remains hidden beneath layers of routine and propriety." As the questioning continued, Holmes moved toward the cabinet once more, examining the surrounding carpet, the floorboards, and even the polished legs of nearby furniture. Each mark, smudge, and imperfection was a note in the silent symphony of the crime. "A subtle scuff here," he murmured, "a displacement of dust there. Watson, one could almost chart the thief's movements as if they were performing a dance." I followed his gaze, trying to understand the significance of each detail. "And all of this points to someone within the household?" "Not conclusively," Holmes replied, "but we are narrowing the possibilities. Opportunity and familiarity remain the central parameters, and it is within this subset that deception takes its most careful and calculated forms." Lady Eleanor interjected, her voice trembling slightly. "You do not suspect any of my staff, do you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes looked toward her, his expression unreadable. "Suspicion, madam, is not accusation. It is observation applied to human behavior. Only when the full pattern emerges can judgment be passed." He then picked up the silk fragment from the envelope in which he had stored it the previous evening. Holding it against the light, he examined the weave, its color, and the faint trace of a reddish tint embedded in the fibers. "This fragment," he said quietly, almost to himself, "was dislodged during the removal of the jewel. Its properties are unique, Watson, originating from a garment likely worn by only one individual within the house. We shall confirm this shortly." Holmes's attention then returned to the cabinet itself, where he noted a faint imperfection in the polished surface of the wood. A shadowed line, barely visible, betrayed the passage of a sleeve or hand, reinforcing his hypothesis that the jewel had been removed by one intimately familiar with the cabinet's operation. As if confirming his suspicions, Holmes directed me to examine the letters on Lady Eleanor's desk once more. He instructed me to hold each at a precise angle beneath the morning light. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how some letters bear pressure from a fingertip inconsistent with the writer's known hand. These impressions, though invisible to the casual observer, suggest handling by someone attempting to familiarize themselves with the contents, perhaps to manipulate knowledge or create a diversion." I nodded, slowly understanding the pattern he was uncovering. "So someone may have studied the letters, the cabinet, and the household routines in advance." "Exactly," Holmes confirmed. "The theft was not impulsive. It was the product of careful observation and planning, executed with precision. And yet, he paused, leaning forward, eyes darkening with thought. There is one inconsistency that escapes the surface inspection. Something does not align with the statements we have received or the physical evidence we have collected. My curiosity flared. And you intend to keep this to yourself until the proper moment? Holmes gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible. Patience, Watson. One cannot force a revelation. It must be allowed to emerge naturally, like a shadow forming at dusk. Any premature disclosure would risk alerting the thief to our awareness. And that, my dear fellow, would squander the advantage we have begun to establish. For the remainder of the morning, Holmes meticulously cross-referenced the servant's movements with the evidence from the cabinet and the silk fragment. He measured angles, noted reflections, and traced the faintest patterns in dust accumulation. I recorded each observation, feeling increasingly aware that each detail was a thread in a complex web, which, when fully woven, would reveal a startling truth. By midday, a tentative pattern began to emerge in Holmes's mind, though he shared nothing with me beyond the faintest glimmers of insight. Observe, Watson, he said, how opportunity, motive, and subtle evidence are converging. The thief's confidence is both their ally and their flaw. They have acted with care, yet in so doing they have left a trail. The challenge lies in interpreting these clues correctly. For misinterpretation leads to misdirection, and misdirection, as you know, is the thief's most potent weapon. Lady Eleanor, observing Holmes' intense scrutiny, could not conceal her hope. "Do you believe the jewel can be recovered?" she asked softly. Holmes inclined his head, eyes still focused on the patterns he traced across the cabinet and floor. "I do. But recovery requires the precise alignment of observation, deduction, and strategic patience. We are on the cusp, madam, yet the final step demands subtlety." As we departed for Baker Street later that afternoon, I could not help but feel the tension tighten around the case like a cord. Holmes's mind was already moving beyond what was visible, connecting fragments of evidence, anticipating deception, and preparing for the moment when the true culprit would be revealed. The vanishing jewel case, it seemed, was poised to unfold in ways that would challenge even the remarkable faculties of Sherlock Holmes. The next morning brought a brittle chill to London, and the fog hung thick over Baker Street, curling against the windows like restless spirits. Holmes was already at his desk, eyes fixed on the silk fragment and the chain, now spread upon the green baize in a manner that suggested a map of invisible connections. I poured steaming tea, but even the comforting aroma could not soften the intensity in Holmes's gaze. "Watson," he began. Without looking up, "It occurs to me that our analysis of opportunity and motive requires a refinement. The thief acted not only with precision, but with knowledge of our observational tendencies. Every detail left behind is calculated to mislead, yet paradoxically, each also betrays the actor's confidence. There is a contradiction, subtle but telling." I leaned forward, eager. "What sort of contradiction?" Holmes finally lifted his gaze, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "The cabinet shows no signs of forced entry. The chain is subtly altered, and the silk fragment matches a sleeve unlikely to be found beyond the household. Yet if the perpetrator were one of the staff, as we suspect, they would know the routines intimately, and yet something in their movements betrays unfamiliarity." He pushed the fragment toward me. "See this, Watson. The silk bears a faint trace of powder, talc or perhaps chalk, unlikely in any household garment. Consider, how often does an attendant's sleeve brush against chalk? Yet here it is, suggesting the thief had recently worn this garment elsewhere. And if so, what does this imply about their story of proximity to the cabinet?" I frowned, attempting to reconcile his observation with the previous testimonies. So the thief might not be entirely internal, yet has access sufficient to remove the jewel without detection? Precisely. A confluence of insider knowledge and outside exposure. It is a delicate balance. Too much familiarity and the theft would appear routine. Too little, and it would have been crude and detectable. Whoever did this has rehearsed the act, perhaps more than once, yet is imperfectly disguised as a routine participant in the household. We arrived at Cavendish House again, just past 10 in the morning. Holmes requested the staff be present, though there was no indication to them that their accounts would be re-examined in such detail. Lady Eleanor's anxiety remained. though she exhibited a faint hope that our continued investigation was inching toward resolution. Holmes's gaze swept the room, noting posture, slight facial twitches, and involuntary gestures that betray hidden truths. "Clara," he began, "I am interested in the morning of the theft. You mentioned tidying the cabinet. Did you notice anything unusual on the chain or the lock?" Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than before. "No, nothing, sir. It appeared as it always does," she said, voice slightly quivering. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Interesting." Watson, note her hesitation. "It is almost imperceptible, yet it exists. Now, Jenkins, the footman, you were present when Lady Fairchild discovered the jewel. Did anything happen as you retrieved her items that could be considered out of the ordinary?" Jenkins stiffened and looked away. "No, sir. Everything was as usual." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Indeed. And yet, Watson, observe the alignment of details. A scuff on the boots, the misplaced chalk on the silk fragment, the tension in Clara's voice all suggest preparation and care, yet with imperfect concealment. It is a dance performed with both expertise and overconfidence." Holmes then moved toward the cabinet, inspecting it once again, now with a magnifying glass trained upon every crevice. "Here," he murmured, "observe the faint impression along the inside of the lock. It is not the forceful indentation one expects from tampering, but a deliberate impression of repeated key usage. Someone has practiced the act, perhaps with a duplicate key, perhaps with the genuine key, but always rehearsed." Lady Eleanor watched intently, her anxiety softened by the intensity of Holmes's focus. "Does this mean—" she began. Holmes did not answer, instead returning to the silk fragment. "Watson, we must test the weave against the garments of the household, yet note the powder embedded within the fibers. I suspect the garment was recently worn outside the house, suggesting that the perpetrator maintains a life beyond domestic routine. I made a note to compare Clara's and Jenkins' uniforms, though neither seemed likely to have such an external garment." Holmes, observing my hesitation, tapped the fragment lightly with his finger. "It is not merely the wearer but the context in which the garment was employed. Our thief operates between two spheres, the familiar household interior and an exterior external world. The intersection is what allowed the jewel's removal without immediate detection." Holmes's attention returned to Lady Eleanor. "Madam, I would ask you to recall any visitors or unusual activity preceding the theft. Even the most mundane occurrence may provide insight. Small details often escape notice precisely because they appear irrelevant." Lady Eleanor thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Well, there was a letter from my cousin, Lady Beatrice. She mentioned sending a package which I expected today, but I cannot recall if it arrived before or after I discovered the jewel's disappearance." Holmes's eyes flickered, and he motioned me closer. "A package, you say? Delivered around the time of the theft?" "Yes," she replied, "but the footman may have handled it." "I barely noticed." Holmes leaned back slightly, tapping the fragment against his lips thoughtfully. "Every misstep is a clue, Watson. A package handled by a servant, a silk fragment bearing chalk from an outside location, and the rehearsed manipulation of the cabinet all converge into a sequence we must now reconstruct. The initial narrative is being contradicted by physical evidence, yet the source of the deception is skillful enough to delay recognition." He paused, eyes darkening with concentration. "We are close, Watson. One overlooked detail, one moment of human frailty, and the veil over this theft will lift. But we must proceed carefully, observing the habitual, the overlooked, and the concealed. Each has left a trace, and each trace carries significance." As the morning wore on, Holmes revisited the cabinet, retraced the servants' paths, and examined Lady Eleanor's letters once again. Each item, gesture, and shadow was scrutinized under his unrelenting gaze. By noon he paused, fingers steepled, eyes distant yet focused. "Watson, the picture is beginning to emerge, though many pieces remain hidden. The perpetrator is clever, confident, and partially disguised as a routine observer. But even the most clever are fallible, and the inconsistencies will reveal themselves. I could sense the tension coiling tighter, each moment carrying the weight of imminent discovery." Holmes's mind moved beyond the surface of actions, threading motive, opportunity, and character into an intricate tapestry. The vanishing jewel case was no longer a simple matter of a missing heirloom. It had become a study of human psychology, observation, and the precise unraveling of deception. And I knew, as always, that Holmes alone could see the threads leading to the truth hidden beneath layers of careful misdirection. The evening descended upon London with its familiar cloak of fog, muffling the city in a soft grey stillness. Holmes and I returned to Cavendish House shortly after 6, the household now accustomed to our persistent inquiries, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. Lady Eleanor greeted us quietly, a faint hope evident in her eyes, yet shadowed by the uncertainty that had gripped the house for several days. Holmes' expression, however, betrayed nothing of hope or doubt. It was the serene concentration of a mind fully engaged. "Watson," he said as we entered the drawing-room, "we have now established opportunity, motive, and a likely sequence of the theft. Yet an inconsistency remains. Something does not align with the physical evidence, the servants' accounts, or the timeline. We shall observe closely today and allow this inconsistency to reveal itself naturally. The thief, confident in their artifice, may betray themselves through the simplest of actions." He moved immediately toward the cabinet, fingers gliding over the polished wood, eyes narrowing on the faint smudges near the lock. "Consider, Watson, the subtle displacement of dust on the floorboards, the orientation of the chain and the silk fragment. These details suggest that the removal of the jewel involved care, practice, and precise timing. Yet the problem arises when we attempt to reconcile these actions with the statements of those present. There is a temporal discrepancy, one so slight that all but the most meticulous would overlook it. It is this that will ultimately direct us to the perpetrator." I watched him, fascinated as always, while he methodically retraced the movements he suspected the thief had taken. Each gesture, each angle of observation seemed to him laden with significance. "So we must find the precise moment at which the timelines diverge," I said. "Exactly, Watson. And observe," he continued, motioning toward the desk where Lady Eleanor's letters lay in neat piles. "Even the letters provide subtle indicators. The impressions upon them are inconsistent with casual handling, yet consistent with a rehearsal, someone deliberately familiarizing themselves with locations, contents, and routines." Holmes then signaled to the maid Clara, who had been quietly attending to her duties. "Clara, would you kindly demonstrate the process by which you access the cabinet in your normal routine?" The girl's hands trembled slightly as she approached. She lifted the chain, inserted the key, and opened the cabinet with practiced ease. Holmes observed intently, noting the minute pressures of her fingers on the key, the angle at which the chain swung, and the brief pause she took before removing any item. "Thank you," he said, dismissing her with a polite nod, though his eyes still scanned her hands, her posture, and the slight adjustment of her sleeve. "Your movements are habitual, yes, but notice, Watson, the lack of chalk or external trace on her clothing. Yet our fragment carries such residue, suggesting that the thief is not purely internal." Jenkins, the footman, was next, and Holmes asked him to describe and demonstrate his movements during the morning in question. The man's recounting was precise, yet when Holmes motioned for him to walk to the cabinet and simulate his retrieval of Lady Eleanor's parcels, I saw the faintest hesitation in his steps, a momentary faltering as he aligned his body with imagined past actions. Holmes's eyes flickered, noting the inconsistency. "Watson," he murmured quietly, "the error lies not in intent but in execution. Even when rehearsed, actions contain unconscious indicators: hesitation, slight misalignment, or unexpected residue. These are the cracks in the facade of practiced deception. One can rehearse a sequence, but one cannot fully control the subtle interactions with the environment." Holmes then moved to the cabinet once more, inspecting the rosewood surfaces under the dim gaslight. He pressed lightly along the inner edges, revealing a nearly invisible abrasion along the top of the lock. "Notice here, Watson, a faint scrape that is inconsistent with regular usage. It is too high for the key itself, suggesting the intervention of a small instrument, perhaps a lever or a duplicated device, employed to lift the jewel with precision. Yet the silk fragment and chalk residue indicate that the operator is not an outsider entirely unknown to the household." Lady Eleanor, watching, spoke hesitantly. "You think it is someone I know?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he tapped the fragment with his gloved fingers and studied it against the fading light. "It is someone with access, Yet the habits and clothing trace indicate external activity. The intersection of these two worlds is critical. Whoever did this is by necessity, operating within two spheres, private and external. We shall soon see whose dual existence provides both knowledge and cover. He then retrieved the chain and held it beneath the light. Watson observed the slight bend near the clasp. Such deformation is consistent with repeated manipulation, yet the degree is unusual for ordinary wear. Whoever handled this keychain did so with deliberate intent, and perhaps a degree of improvisation. Now, when combined with the chalked silk fragment, we begin to see a profile emerging. A careful, practiced yet imperfectly disguised actor, likely rehearsing in private to avoid detection. Holmes stood back and closed his eyes briefly, his mind clearly racing. We are very close. Observe, Watson, how each contradiction, each seemingly minor deviation from habit, draws us nearer to the hidden truth. Opportunity, motive, and execution are aligned only in the mind of the operator. One misstep, one overlooked mark, and their carefully constructed illusion collapses. He motioned for me to follow him through the hallways of Cavendish House. We retraced the suspected path of the thief, noting floorboards, door frames, and furniture placement. Holmes paused at a narrow corridor leading to the servants' quarters. Here, Watson, the scuffing of the boots, the light dust of chalk, and the subtle misalignment of a floorboard suggest the operator retraced steps deliberately yet hurriedly. They were aware of observation, yet allowed small inconsistencies to remain, either out of confidence or oversight. One or the other, Watson, is always the source of exposure. By the time dusk settled, Holmes had assembled a careful reconstruction of the theft in his mind. He had not yet revealed the culprit, nor did he indicate to Lady Eleanor the narrowing of his suspicion, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that suggested the resolution was imminent. The trick in these cases, he said softly, almost to himself, is to allow the perpetrator's own methods to betray them. The carefully crafted narrative of innocence contains within it the seeds of exposure. We wait, observe, and allow those seeds to blossom. As we departed for Baker Street that evening, the fog pressing against the carriage windows, I reflected on Holmes's method. The vanishing jewel case was no ordinary theft. It was a study in human duplicity, subtle misdirection, and precise observation. Every small clue, the silk fragment, the chalk, the keychain's bend, the scuffs on the floor, was a whisper in a language only Holmes could read fluently. And I knew, with both apprehension and admiration, that the next revelation would come not from haste or luck, but from the meticulous patience and brilliant calculation of Sherlock Holmes. The following morning, a thin drizzle coated the streets of London, turning the gaslit avenues into gleaming ribbons of muted gold. Holmes and I arrived at Cavendish House with a quiet determination, the weight of the previous day's discoveries pressing upon us. The household was already astir, the servants moving with heightened awareness, their glances quick and uncertain. Lady Eleanor met us at the door, her expression anxious yet guarded, as if she sensed a turning point approaching in this delicate matter. Holmes did not linger with pleasantries. He swept into the drawing-room, surveying the cabinet and the letters with his customary intensity. Watson, today we shall begin to press our theory into practice. Observation alone has carried us far, yet the final step requires not only scrutiny, but orchestration. The perpetrator is clever, confident, and aware of the appearance of innocence. We shall test this awareness. He turned to Lady Eleanor. Madam, I would request that all household staff perform their usual duties precisely as yesterday morning. There is nothing to alarm them, simply routine observation. We shall see whether their actions reveal deviations from their established patterns. The servants obeyed with quiet compliance, though I could see the tension in their measured movements. Holmes observed every gesture, posture, and hesitation, occasionally stepping closer to inspect a scuff on the carpet or a misaligned letter on the desk. His eyes never wavered from the subtle indicators that would betray the practiced but imperfect hand of the thief. Notice, he said softly, the footman hesitates ever so slightly when passing the corridor near the cabinet. That is the key, Watson. All prior movement has been calculated, yet the uncertainty remains. It is a fissure in the facade, an opening we shall exploit. Holmes then directed his attention to Clara, the maid whose silk sleeve had left the fragment earlier. Clara, would you mind dusting the cabinet as usual? He requested. Her hands trembled. betraying a subtle anxiety that did not go unnoticed. She obeyed, yet the faintest tremor in her grip caused a shift in the chain of the cabinet key. Holmes's eyes glinted. Watson, see the micro-adjustment in the chain. The operator of yesterday's theft would have manipulated it with precision. Yet now the awareness of observation introduces a hesitation. Such a response is telling. The mind calculates, but the subconscious betrays intention. As the morning progressed, a sudden commotion erupted near the rear of the house. Jenkins, the footman, had stumbled upon an overturned letter tray scattering correspondence across the polished floor. The movement seemed minor, yet Holmes's eyes lit with intensity. He knelt, examining the letter's edges, the indentation of the impressions and the alignment of the scattered sheets. "Watson," he whispered, "observe this. A minor disturbance, perhaps accidental, yet it exposes the habitual path of the hand that arranged these letters. Look at the slight crease along the corner of Lady Beatrice's note, exactly where it would have been handled in secret. This is the second layer of misdirection. The thief has sought to manipulate timing and appearance, yet small, almost imperceptible traces remain." Lady Eleanor approached anxiously. "Is something wrong, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes straightened, his eyes still scanning the floor. "Nothing fatal, madam, merely a confirmation. The thief's previous familiarity with the household has led them to manipulate the letters, yet their haste or overconfidence has left a clue for the careful observer. We now see the interplay between internal knowledge and external action. Our mystery begins to clarify." He motioned for me to follow him through the hallway, leading toward the servants' quarters. "Notice the scuffs on the floorboards here. They are inconsistent with ordinary traffic and suggest a repeated, deliberate pattern of movement. Paired with the chalk on the silk fragment, it indicates an individual moving between private quarters and areas less frequently visited by others. The choreography of theft is thus partially revealed, though the actor remains confident in their artifice. As we examined the path, a sudden realization struck Holmes. "Watson," he said, voice low and precise, "there is a second event, subtle but critical, that has altered our perspective. Observe the window in the corridor. The latch shows recent manipulation. It is not forced, merely moved. Someone has attempted, either deliberately or inadvertently, to create an alternative route or a false impression of access. This is the work of a mind seeking to confuse the observer." I followed his gaze, noting the faint smudge along the latch. "So the thief may have intended to mislead us further, suggesting an entrance that was not used." "Exactly," Holmes confirmed. "The misdirection is part of the strategy. The cleverest criminals, Watson, are those who leave contradictions precisely where we expect uniformity. And herein lies our opportunity. By observing how they respond to continued scrutiny, we provoke an action that exposes them." Returning to the drawing room, Holmes positioned himself near the cabinet, seemingly absorbed in observation. Lady Eleanor's maid resumed her duties, and the footman carried parcels across the room. Holmes' eyes flickered repeatedly towards subtle indicators. The faint tremor in Clara's hands, the hesitation in Jenkins's step, the careful alignment of papers by the housekeeper. Each movement was catalogued, assessed, and stored in his extraordinary memory. Then, as if prompted by our silent anticipation, Clara approached the cabinet, ostensibly to dust, but her hand lingered near the key, as though she were unconsciously rehearsing a previous action. Holmes' lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. "Ah, Watson, see what I have been waiting for. Observe the unconscious repetition, the habitual gesture that betrays rehearsal. This is the fissure in their confidence, the subtle slip that confirms my suspicions. I watched, astonished, as Holmes leaned forward slightly, hands steepled. The perpetrator is clever, confident, and aware of observation, yet they cannot escape the imprint of habit. Their dual existence, both internal and external, creates tension that manifests in these micro-actions. And it is precisely here, Watson, that we shall find the truth." Lady Eleanor, sensing the intensity, asked cautiously, "Can you recover the jewel now?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he allowed the tension to linger, eyes never leaving the gestures of the staff. "We are very close, madam. The next misstep, however minor, will allow us to reconstruct not only the theft but the mind behind it. It is a matter of patience, observation, and timing. The Vanishing jewel case is poised on the edge of revelation. By late afternoon, The pattern had emerged, the thief's movements, previously concealed beneath deliberate gestures and practiced routines, had begun to fracture under the weight of continuous observation. The combination of internal knowledge, external experience, and overconfidence had produced subtle cracks. Holmes had guided the investigation to the point where these fissures would soon become impossible to ignore. And the moment of exposure was imminent. That evening, Baker Street was cloaked in its usual fog, the city outside muted and indistinct. As if London itself held its breath in anticipation, Holmes and I returned to Cavendish House under the guise of routine investigation, but I could sense a subtle electricity in his manner, the quiet intensity that always preceded a carefully orchestrated plan. Lady Eleanor greeted us at the door, relief and curiosity mingling in her expression, though she could scarcely imagine the intricate maneuver Holmes had prepared to expose the thief. Holmes did not delay. "Watson, we now know the thief operates with both familiarity and external sophistication. The patterns of hesitation, the trace of chalk, and the habitual gestures have all been observed. It is time to apply strategy rather than mere observation. We shall orchestrate circumstances to provoke a revealing action." He instructed Lady Eleanor to maintain her usual household routines, emphasizing nothing out of the ordinary. All staff were to perform their duties precisely as before. The genius of Holmes's plan lay in its simplicity, to maintain normality, while subtly directing the sequence of events in a manner that would pressure the thief into revealing themselves. Holmes positioned himself near the cabinet, feigning intense scrutiny of the letters and documents, while I observed alongside him. "Note, Watson, the importance of subtlety," he whispered. "The keenest minds can be forced to act under pressure if the environment aligns precisely with their expectations and fears." The servants moved through their routines, careful, measured. Yet I noticed that Jenkins, the footman, lingered near the corridor leading to the cabinet, eyes darting toward Holmes with a faint nervousness. Holmes, without looking directly at him, subtly shifted his stance, creating a line of sight that Jenkins could not avoid noticing. "Observe the dance, Watson," Holmes murmured. "We have created the conditions in which the thief cannot help but respond. Confidence cracks when habitual routines are disrupted, even ever so slightly. The unconscious mind betrays those who believe themselves concealed." Minutes passed, and Holmes continued his meticulous observation. Then a small tremor of movement caught his eye. Clara, the maid, approached the cabinet with her usual dusting cloth, but her hand lingered near the chain longer than necessary. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the papers on the desk, as if gauging Holmes's attention. He leaned forward slightly, just enough for her to perceive that she was being closely watched. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "observe what I have been waiting for." The habitual gesture, the rehearsal, cannot be entirely suppressed. See how her hand pauses almost unconsciously over the key. This is the moment the trap is sprung, not by force, but by subtle provocation. As she adjusted the chain, a slight clink resonated, barely audible, yet Holmes's ears caught it with precision. His eyes brightened. "There, Watson." The small, seemingly insignificant sound confirms my suspicion. The dual nature of her actions, the combination of domestic familiarity and external rehearsal, is fully revealed. The perpetrator has unwittingly betrayed themselves through habit and subconscious anticipation of the cabinet's contents. Holmes stood and moved with quiet precision toward Clara, maintaining his calm demeanor while signaling Lady Eleanor to remain at a distance. "Clara, may I inquire," he said in his even, incisive tone, "about the movements of the morning in which the jewel disappeared, specifically the use of this key and chain?" The girl's hands trembled, and for the first time her composure faltered entirely. I don't understand, sir," she stammered, glancing toward the doorway as if searching for an escape. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "There is no need to invent explanations, Clara. Observation, small details, and consistency are sufficient. The fragment of silk, the chalk residue, the habitual gestures, these all tell the story of actions you cannot deny." Clara's face paled, and she took an involuntary step backward. It wasn't meant to be discovered," she whispered, eyes filling with panic. "I only meant to borrow it. I thought no one would notice." Holmes inclined his head, expression neutral yet carrying an unmistakable authority. "The means and the motive are clear now, Watson." She possessed both opportunity and familiarity, yet her external connections, her movements beyond the household, introduced elements that left traces. Every small gesture, every habitual act, betrayed the truth in ways she could not suppress. I stepped forward, amazed by the precision of his deductions. Holmes, the silk fragment, the chalk, all of it converged perfectly with her movements. Incredible. Holmes's lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile. It is rarely mere chance, Watson. The brilliance or misfortune of the perpetrator lies in the combination of skill and imperfection. Even the most careful planning can be unraveled by habit, repetition, or the subtle pressure of observation. In this case, patience, environmental orchestration, and careful attention to human nature have revealed the truth. Lady Eleanor approached slowly, relief evident in her features. Then, the jewel can be recovered. Holmes turned toward the cabinet and lifted the chain, his expression calm but triumphant. Indeed, madam, the jewel remains within reach, and its retrieval is but a matter of procedure. The most important aspect of this case, however, has been understanding the mind behind the act. The evidence, the fragment, the chalk, the gestures, has allowed us to reconstruct not only the theft, but the method of deception. Clara sank into a chair, her face a mixture of shame and resignation. I only wanted to impress someone outside. I never imagined it would become such a matter of consequence, she confessed. Holmes observed her quietly for a moment, as if weighing the gravity of her confession. Your motives, while human and understandable, do not negate the seriousness of the act. Yet, in observing your behavior, I have also observed the precise methods by which deception manifests. Let this serve as a lesson. The smallest trace, when combined with patience and scrutiny, is sufficient to reveal truth. I took notes feverishly, recording the culmination of deduction I had witnessed. Holmes had orchestrated an environment that forced the unconscious mind to betray itself, demonstrating the delicate interplay of human behavior, habit, and careful observation. As we departed Cavendish House later that evening, the fog now pressing thickly against the carriage windows, I could not help but marvel at Holmes's genius. The vanishing jewel case had begun with subtlety, a missing heirloom, minor contradictions, and the quiet traces of human movement, and had unfolded into a study of psychology, observation, and the inexorable triumph of deduction over deception. Holmes, as always, remained a step ahead, orchestrating events with precision, patience, and insight beyond ordinary comprehension. The jewel was recovered, the culprit identified, and yet, the true revelation lay in the method, Holmes's understanding of human nature, his manipulation of circumstance, and the inexhaustible power of his analytical mind. I realized then that in cases such as these, the crime itself was secondary to the extraordinary skill with which it was revealed. As the household settled into an uneasy quiet, Lady Eleanor seated herself in the drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on Holmes, who remained standing with an air of calm authority. Clara, the maid, now pale and subdued, sat across the room, the weight of discovery pressing heavily upon her. I remained close by, noting each expression, gesture and nuance, for even in moments of confession, there are threads of subtlety that can illuminate the truth further. Holmes began to speak, his voice measured, deliberate, and compelling, drawing the attention of every person present. Madam, what we have witnessed over the past several days is a sequence of events, carefully orchestrated yet imperfectly executed. It is essential that you understand not only the act itself, but the reasoning and methods behind it, for the genius of this case lies in the deception as much as in the theft. He turned to me briefly, eyes bright, then returned to Lady Eleanor and Clara. The disappearance of your jewel, the vanishing sapphire, was not an impulsive crime. The operator understood the household intimately, knew the positions of furniture, the schedules of the staff, and the usual routines that govern domestic life. This knowledge allowed the theft to be executed with precision, yet precision alone does not conceal human imperfection. Holmes walked slowly toward the cabinet, lifting the key and chain with deliberate care. Consider this cabinet. No signs of forced entry, no visible marks to suggest violence or carelessness. Yet observe the chain's subtle bend, the minute scuff on the floorboard, and the displacement of dust. These are not mere accidents. They are traces left by a practiced hand, executed repeatedly in private rehearsal. He then held the silk fragment between his gloved fingers, angling it toward the fading light of the room. This fragment is critical, Watson. Its weave and coloration are unique to a sleeve worn by an individual recently exposed to an external environment, not purely internal to this household. The residue upon it, talc or chalk, further confirms movement beyond the immediate domestic sphere, indicating that the perpetrator maintains both internal access and an external life. The juxtaposition of these two spheres is what allowed the theft to occur. Holmes's gaze shifted to Clara. Miss Clara, your gestures, although practiced, betrayed the unconscious mind. The tremor of the hand, the hesitation at the key, and the repeated unconscious alignment of letters all constitute evidence. Even when attempting to feign routine, you could not suppress habitual memory of your previous actions. It is this subtle human imperfection that has revealed the truth. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide, and her voice trembled. I did not mean harm. I only wanted to show someone outside. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Human motive is rarely devoid of emotion, curiosity, or desire. What distinguishes the criminal in such cases is not solely intent, but the skill or lack thereof with which they manage the intersection of opportunity, routine, and external knowledge. You acted with care, yet care cannot erase traces, especially when subjected to patient, attentive observation. Turning to Lady Eleanor, Holmes continued, Madam, the jewel itself remained within reach throughout. Its removal was discreet, calculated, and temporary, yet even in such precise execution, the perpetrator's own habits betrayed them. The chalk on the silk, the scuff on the floor, the subtle bends in the keychain, these seemingly minor details formed a network of evidence that, when interpreted correctly, reconstructed the sequence of the theft in its entirety. Holmes moved closer to the letters on the desk. Even these were manipulated. Note the impressions upon the paper, the slight crease along the corner of Lady Beatrice's note. They indicate repeated handling, rehearsal, and the creation of a narrative designed to mislead observers. Such intentional misdirection is the hallmark of a mind calculating both action and perception simultaneously. He stepped back, eyes sweeping the room with a penetrating intensity. Observe, Watson, how the perpetrator sought to balance confidence with concealment. The dual existence, internal routine and external exposure, created conditions where micro-errors became inevitable. Each hesitation, tremor, and deviation from habit forms the map of culpability. What might seem trivial to a casual observer is, in fact, a telling signature of action. Opportunity and error. I realized as Holmes paused that he was building a full reconstruction in the minds of those present. Each clue, each trace, each gesture had been placed, observed, and now woven into a coherent narrative that left no room for doubt. Holmes, I said softly, the clarity with which you present this, it is as though the theft itself has unfolded before us anew. Holmes's lips curved slightly. Precisely, Watson. The ultimate triumph in such a case lies not only in recovery of the object, but in rendering the invisible visible. The narrative of misdirection is broken down, showing not only what was done but how and why it was executed. Our understanding of human behavior, the habitual, the subconscious, and the deliberate, has allowed us to illuminate the path of the thief completely. He turned back to Clara, voice gentle yet firm. Miss Clara, your exposure here is not merely punitive, it is instructive. Every action leaves a trace. Every habit forms a pattern. Even the cleverest individual, when operating within known routines, will leave indicators for the attentive observer. This lesson, difficult though it may be, demonstrates the inexorable power of careful deduction over deception. Clara nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand, sir, I will not forget. Holmes finally faced Lady Eleanor once more. Madam, the jewel can be retrieved and restored to your possession. Yet the greater lesson lies in vigilance, observation, and understanding the nature of human action. The Vanishing jewel case, while seemingly a simple theft, has proven to be a complex study of psychology, habit, and the interplay of internal familiarity and external experience. He placed the chain and jewel back within the cabinet, securing it with care. And now, madam, the matter is concluded. The object recovered, the perpetrator identified, and the intricacies of their method laid bare. We see in such cases that truth is never a product of chance but of observation, patience, and methodical reasoning. I sat back, awe still gripping me. Holmes had not merely solved a theft. He had demonstrated the profound depth of deduction, the subtle interplay of human behavior, and the delicate art of exposing deception. The household exhaled collectively, relief washing over Lady Eleanor, while Clara, chastened yet enlightened, absorbed the weight of the lesson imparted. Holmes, turning to me finally, gave that faint, almost imperceptible smile he reserved for moments of personal satisfaction. Watson, in the end, it is always the smallest traces, the unconscious habits, and the careful observation that unravel even the most carefully constructed deception. The mind is the most revealing instrument, and the subtle tells are everywhere if one knows how to observe. I realized, as I followed him from the drawing-room into the fog-drenched streets of London, that the vanishing jewel case had not only restored a precious item, but had illuminated once again the extraordinary genius of Sherlock Holmes and the unerring power of logical deduction. The next morning dawned with a soft haze over London, the mist curling between chimneys and over the cobblestone streets, as though the city itself wished to conceal its secrets just a little longer. Holmes and I arrived at Cavendish House to find the atmosphere transformed, relieved, yes, but tempered, with a quiet tension that comes after a truth is revealed. Lady Eleanor moved about the drawing-room with an ease she had not possessed before. The recovered jewel safely returned to its place, yet her eyes reflected both wonder and lingering anxiety. Holmes, however, seemed indifferent to the household's emotional recovery. He stood near the window, fingers steepled, gaze distant as if already tracing the contours of another puzzle in his mind. I observed him quietly. He was never one to dwell unnecessarily, yet the satisfaction of a case resolved always tempered his detachment with a subtle, almost imperceptible glow of triumph. "Madame," he said finally, turning his sharp gaze toward Lady Eleanor, "the vanishing jewel case is concluded. The object has been restored, and the method of deception laid bare. Yet in such matters, the real lesson lies not in possession but in understanding. Observation, patience, and logic. These are your true safeguards against both error and deceit." Lady Eleanor nodded slowly. "Mr. Holmes, I am profoundly grateful. I confess I could not imagine how a jewel could disappear and yet be recovered without detection. Your method is extraordinary." Holmes inclined his head briefly, his expression calm yet perceptive. "Extraordinary, perhaps, only in its application. The principles themselves are not uncommon. Attention to detail, awareness of human behavior, and careful deduction. It is the practice of these principles that produces what you perceive as extraordinary." Clara, sitting quietly with her hands clasped, now seemed contemplative rather than fearful. Holmes's approach had not been harsh. It had been illuminating. "I understand now, sir," she said softly, "that even small actions, even habits, can be noticed. I see how my gestures betrayed me." "Precisely, Miss Clara," Holmes replied. "You acted with intelligence and care, yet human nature is never entirely disciplined. Habit, memory, and subtle impulses reveal truth despite conscious concealment. Your error was not a failure of intellect, but a predictable consequence of human psychology. Let this understanding guide you in the future." I could not resist adding, "Holmes, it is remarkable how each detail, the chalk, the silk fragment, the keychain, the gestures, formed a chain that only your observation could link so flawlessly." Holmes's gaze flicked toward me, a faint sparkle in his eyes. "Flawless, Watson, only in the mind of the observer. The real beauty of deduction lies in its subtlety. Every piece, no matter how small, contributes to the whole. The art is in perceiving the significance of those pieces and in guiding circumstances so that even the cleverest misdirection becomes transparent." Lady Eleanor approached the cabinet, now restored and gleaming. She lifted the jewel reverently, its facets catching the morning light, "It is more beautiful than I remembered," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "Yet I am equally impressed by how it was recovered and how the truth was revealed without harm or scandal." Holmes's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Madam, the jewel's beauty is matched only by the complexity of human behavior. The interplay of observation, motive, and routine reveals far more than the object itself. In every case, one must remember that people, not possessions, are the true subjects of study. Objects are but indicators of the mind that interacts with them. I noticed, as Holmes continued to speak, that his philosophy extended beyond this single case. "Watson," he said, "we must always be mindful of the small traces, the habits, the unconscious, tells that escape ordinary notice. It is through these that the extraordinary is revealed, whether in theft, deceit, or any seemingly unsolvable problem. Human nature leaves clues always, and the diligent observer can read them with certainty." Lady Eleanor, now calm, looked at Clara and then to Jenkins and the other staff. "Let this be a lesson to us all," she said, "that diligence and honesty are paramount, and that even the smallest actions carry consequences." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, madam. And for the diligent observer, these small actions provide the keys to understanding, prevention, and resolution. One must always remember that truth is not hidden forever. It is only waiting to be discerned by careful scrutiny and reasoning." As we prepared to depart, Holmes lingered briefly, glancing once more at the cabinet, the recovered jewel, and the household that had been both the stage and the audience of his deductions. "Watson," he said softly as we stepped into the foggy streets, "it is a peculiar satisfaction to witness the convergence of preparation, observation, and human nature. In this case, every act, every gesture, and every trace combined to form a narrative so intricate that it might have confounded ordinary reasoning. Yet through patient analysis, the invisible becomes visible, and the truth asserts itself inevitably. I could not help but marvel at his brilliance. Holmes, it is astonishing how you can see what others cannot, how you perceive the connections between subtle gestures and motive. It is nothing short of genius." Holmes smiled faintly, though in his usual reserved manner. "Genius, Watson, is but the application of patience, logic, and observation in combination. There is no mystery that cannot be solved if one approaches it methodically. And now we move on, for there are always other cases demanding attention, other truths awaiting discovery, and other subtleties of human behavior to illuminate." As we walked back toward Baker Street, the fog curling around the gas lamps like smoke in a theatre, I reflected on the lessons of the vanishing jewel case. The jewel itself was recovered, yes, but the true victory lay in the revelation of character, the exposition of human imperfection, and the demonstration of deduction in its purest form. Holmes had not only solved a crime, he had imparted a lesson in observation, patience, and the inexorable triumph of reason over deception. The city around us continued its muted rhythm, oblivious to the extraordinary events that had unfolded within Cavendish House. And yet, as always, I knew that for Holmes, each resolved case was merely a pause before the next challenge, the next puzzle, the next intricate web of human behavior, waiting to be unraveled with unerring precision. The vanishing jewel case had ended, but the mind of Sherlock Holmes remained ever vigilant, ever observant, ever ready for the next enigma that London would place before him. Though the vanishing jewel case had reached its formal conclusion, the echoes of its lessons lingered in the quiet of Baker Street. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, pipe in hand, eyes distant yet alert, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. I settled across from him, journal ready, compelled by a mixture of awe and the unquenchable curiosity that always accompanied the aftermath of his investigations. Even when a case appeared resolved, Holmes's mind never rested. It moved perpetually, tracing invisible lines, analyzing subtleties others could scarcely perceive. "Watson," he began without preamble, "the value of a case is measured not merely by its resolution, but by the understanding it affords of human behavior, patterns, and fallibility. Consider the vanishing jewel incident. An ostensibly simple theft evolved into a study of routine, habit, and subconscious betrayal. Each actor, the staff, the household, the unsuspecting thief, contributed to the narrative through micro-actions that revealed intentions beyond conscious awareness." I nodded, still absorbing the depth of his observations. It is remarkable how every detail, the chalk on the silk, the scuff marks, even the alignment of letters, played a role in reconstructing the sequence of events. One could hardly imagine that such minutiae would reveal the entire truth. Holmes's eyes gleamed with intensity. "Precisely, Watson. The seemingly trivial is often the most revealing. Human behavior cannot be entirely masked, no matter the skill or intent behind it. In every action, there are residual traces, micro-expressions, habitual gestures, physical evidence, that when combined with careful observation, illuminate the mind behind them. The external act is a reflection of internal knowledge and error. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine with a sharpness that compelled attention. In this case, we were fortunate. The thief was clever yet predictable in the constraints of habit. They attempted to manipulate the environment, rehearse actions, and control perception. Yet human nature introduced inconsistency. It is always the subtle inconsistency, Watson, that reveals the truth. Opportunity, routine, and duality of existence create fertile ground for detection when one knows how to observe. I reflected on his words. So in a sense, the case was less about the jewel itself and more about decoding the behaviors surrounding it. Holmes inclined his head slightly, a rare acknowledgement of agreement. Exactly. Objects are merely markers. The mind is the map. Every element of the theft, the chalk, the silk fragment, the keychain, the scuffs on the floor, even the minor misalignment of papers, serves to trace the contours of intention and action. The jewel's recovery, while significant, is secondary to understanding the methodology that allowed the theft to occur. He paused, inhaling deeply from his pipe, exhaling slowly as if to punctuate the lesson. The intellectual satisfaction comes not from possession or restoration, but from discerning patterns, predicting outcomes, and ultimately observing the inevitable exposure of deception. A well-trained mind can anticipate, reconstruct, and deduce with remarkable precision. That is the true reward of such cases. I jotted notes diligently, fascinated by the philosophical undercurrent beneath his precise reasoning. Holmes, do you believe that every act of theft or deception, no matter how meticulously planned, will leave these residual traces if one knows how to observe? Almost invariably, Watson, he replied, voice quiet but firm. Even the most practiced deceivers carry within them subtle imperfections, moments of hesitation, habitual gestures, unconscious adjustments to environment. These are the fingerprints of human nature, and it is precisely in these unguarded moments that a patient, keen observer discovers the truth. Perfection is a myth. Habit is reality. He gestured toward the window, where the fog of London blurred the gas lamps into ghostly halos. Observe the city itself, Watson. Its streets, its alleys, its unending rhythm of human movement, all of it is a canvas upon which the ordinary and the extraordinary play out. Just as we observed the traces in Cavendish House, the careful observer can read the hidden narratives of life itself, provided one attends to subtle detail and maintains unwavering patience. I leaned back, struck by the gravity and scope of his reflection. In that light, every case, every small detail, even a fragment of evidence, is a window into human nature. Holmes allowed a faint smile to form. Indeed. And it is the privilege of the detective to peer through those windows, reconstruct the unseen, and illuminate the invisible patterns that govern action. In every case, the detective's task is to convert the chaos of ordinary movement and human error into a coherent narrative, revealing intention and method with clarity that others cannot perceive. For a moment, he fell silent, gaze distant yet precise, and I realized that even now, his mind continued to wander through corridors of possibility, retracing steps, connecting minutiae and assessing human behavior. Watson, he said finally, the Vanishing jewel case may have concluded in terms of objects recovered and culprit identified, yet its value endures in the understanding it imparts. In every subsequent encounter, every future case, one carries these lessons: patience, acute observation, recognition of habit, and the capacity to perceive the unconscious signals that humans leave behind. These are tools far more valuable than any tangible reward. I watched him, marveling at the depth and clarity of his insight. Holmes, your method turns ordinary events into profound lessons. It is as though the resolution of a single theft offers instruction in the entire spectrum of human conduct. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the accuracy of my observation without indulging in sentimentality. Exactly, Watson. The detective must see beyond the object, beyond the immediate act, to the underlying human behavior that drives it. In the Vanishing jewel case, We did not merely recover a gem. We dissected a sequence of decisions, gestures, and unconscious tells, thereby revealing the operator's mind. That, in the end, is the essence of deduction. I sat back, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. The city outside remained shrouded in mist, unaware of the quiet, relentless intellect that walked its streets, ever vigilant, ever observant. Holmes, serene yet alive with that subtle intensity that made him incomparable, leaned back in his chair, pipe glowing faintly. His expression suggested readiness, not for rest but for the next enigma, the next puzzle, the next challenge that would demand every measure of his extraordinary powers. "Watson," he said softly, almost to himself, "let us rest briefly. The vanishing jewel case is concluded, but there will always be another mystery, another subtlety of human behavior awaiting analysis. One must simply be prepared to see, to observe, and to deduce with unwavering clarity." I realized then, as I always did after such encounters, that our lives were inseparable from these perpetual enigmas. The city, the people, the subtle interplay of habit and error, all formed a tapestry that Holmes could read with unmatched acuity. And though one case ended, the pursuit of knowledge, observation, and deduction never ceased, for in the mind of Sherlock Holmes there was no finality, only the eternal, patient quest for truth amidst the shadows of human nature. The vanishing jewel case had concluded in form, but in essence, it had revealed the enduring principles that govern both crime and detection, leaving a lesson that for Watson and Holmes alike would echo indefinitely, that in the smallest detail lies the greatest truth, and in the patient eye, the mind's most secret movements are inevitably revealed. The days following the vanishing jewel case passed with an almost ordinary rhythm. Yet ordinary it was not, for the lessons and echoes of Holmes's deductions lingered in every quiet moment at Baker Street. Holmes remained at his desk, surrounded by the familiar chaos of books, papers, and chemical apparatus, yet his mind, ever restless, seemed elsewhere, still following invisible threads of human behavior, still anticipating the next puzzle that London might place before him. I observed him as often as I could, noting the subtle shifts in expression, the occasional spark of excitement when a thought struck him with sudden clarity. "Watson," he said one morning, breaking the silence that had settled between us, "the value of any completed case is often measured not in the satisfaction of resolution, but in the understanding it affords for all future inquiries. Consider the vanishing jewel incident. Every subtle gesture, hesitation, and trace of behavior has provided a model for detection that transcends this single instance. The lessons are eternal, not ephemeral." I nodded, still reflecting upon the intricacy of his methodology. "It is remarkable, Holmes, how a single theft could unfold into such a comprehensive study of human behavior. The micro-actions, the habitual gestures, and the unconscious reactions, each a clue in itself, each contributing to the full narrative." Holmes's eyes gleamed, and he allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Precisely, Watson. And yet, what fascinates me most is how these micro-actions are repeated, unnoticed, unexamined by all but the most vigilant observer. The human mind cannot entirely conceal itself, even under deliberate effort. Opportunity and habit conspire to reveal truth, provided one is attentive and methodical." He paused, considering the patterns he had observed in the past weeks. "There is another principle at work here, equally vital: misdirection. The clever perpetrator will often design actions to draw attention away from the true path. Yet misdirection itself leaves a trail, Watson. Tiny inconsistencies, minute contradictions, faint echoes of intent that betray the orchestrator. It is in the synthesis of these fragments that the detective finds clarity." I leaned back, intrigued by the philosophical undertone of his reflection. "So every case is as much about reading human nature as it is about observing physical evidence." Holmes inclined his head sharply, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Indeed, the object, the theft, the apparent mystery, these are merely the outward manifestations. The true investigation lies in discerning motive, method, and subtlety of action. Once the observer understands the interplay of these forces, the solution becomes not only inevitable, but illuminating. In this way, Watson, every solved case becomes a study in human behavior, a lesson in observation and a map of the mind itself." He turned toward the window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the hazy contours of London's rooftops. Observe, for example, the movement of the city's denizens. Each individual acts with intent, constrained by routine, habit, and desire. The casual observer sees only the surface. The detective reads the invisible, noting every small deviation, every hesitation, every repetition. It is, in a sense, a perpetual study, one that never ends because human behavior is infinite in its complexity and variation. I could not help but marvel at the scope of his insight. It seems, Holmes, that each case is a microcosm of society itself, a window into human nature, habit, and error. Holmes' lips curved in a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. Exactly, Watson. And that, I believe, is the enduring reward of our work. Not merely solving a crime or recovering a jewel, but illuminating the patterns of thought and action that govern all human conduct. It is a lesson in vigilance, patience, and the inexorable value of methodical reasoning. He sank into his chair, pipe in hand, contemplative yet relaxed. The lines of concentration around his eyes softened by quiet satisfaction. The vanishing jewel case is now behind us, yet its teachings persist. Each new day, each new observation, adds to our understanding of the subtle, often invisible, forces that shape human behavior. In time, these insights form the foundation of deduction itself. I recorded his words diligently, noting both their immediate relevance and their philosophical resonance. Holmes had not merely concluded a single investigation. He had imparted a framework for understanding the world, grounded in logic, observation, and insight. Watson, he continued, voice quiet but firm, it is essential to remember that deduction is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Every object, every gesture, every interaction carries meaning. To neglect these details is to ignore the map that reveals intention, motive, and method. The diligent observer sees, interprets, and predicts with accuracy. The careless misses the narrative entirely. I realized then that Holmes's work extended far beyond the resolution of individual mysteries. Each case was a lesson, each observation a key, each subtle detail a thread in the vast tapestry of human behavior. And in the vanishing jewel case, these principles had converged perfectly. The recovery of the object was only the surface. The revelation of method, motive, and human imperfection was the true triumph. Holmes looked at me finally, eyes steady, voice calm but carrying that unmistakable intensity. And so, Watson, we remain ever vigilant, ever prepared. The city, the streets, and the people of London are a constant source of puzzles, each with its own pattern, rhythm, and subtlety. Our task is to observe, to deduce, and to illuminate the truth that lies beneath the surface, unseen by all but the patient and the attentive. I nodded, understanding the magnitude of his words. The vanishing jewel case had ended, yet it had opened a wider vista of perception and insight, teaching lessons that extended far beyond the walls of Cavendish House. Holmes, as always, remained ahead of the ordinary observer, a perpetual seeker of truth amidst the subtle chaos of human nature. As the fog thickened over London and the gas lamps glimmered faintly through the mist, I realized that life with Sherlock Holmes was an ongoing journey. Each case a lesson, each observation a key to understanding. And though one mystery had been solved, another awaited, ready to test our powers of deduction, to illuminate the patterns of human behavior, and to reaffirm once again the extraordinary brilliance of the mind that could discern the invisible and render it comprehensible. In the quiet of Baker Street, as Holmes settled into his chair, pipe glowing, and I reflected on the extraordinary events we had witnessed, it became clear. The vanishing jewel case was more than a resolved theft. It was a testament to the enduring power of observation, logic, and human understanding, and a reminder that with patience, reason, and insight, even the most subtle deception is ultimately revealed. And so, as London exhaled its foggy breath into the evening sky, the case closed not only in fact but in lesson, leaving us with the timeless truth that for those who observe keenly, reason patiently, and think deeply, the world reveals its secrets. One trace, one gesture, one micro detail at a time.